The sun had not yet kissed the Spanish hills when Ethan Calloway, 71 years old and tired in ways that sleep couldn't cure, stood at his usual spot near the reserve's eastern boundary, 200 meters away. A shadow moved against the ridge, elegant, spotted, impossibly still. The cheetah was watching him. She always did at this hour. 6 months ago, I broke every rule I'd spent 30 years defending. I shattered protocols that existed for good reason, destroyed professional relationships built over decades, and risked everything I'd worked to preserve, all for a dying cheetah and 3 cubs who shouldn't have mattered more than principle. Yet here we stand, morning after morning, in our silent communion, close enough to remember, far enough to respect. How do you say goodbye to someone who saved you by letting you save them? But to understand this impossible bond, I must tell you about the day everything changed. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. The Sierra de Andújar Conservation Reserve stretched across 50,000 acres of southern Spain, a patchwork of Mediterranean forest and grassland where the modern world ended and something older began. American conservationists had established it in the early 1990s, dreaming of a place where European wildlife could thrive under careful watch but minimal interference. It was a delicate balance, observatory rather than zoo, sanctuary rather than playground. Ethan Calloway had never intended to become part of this landscape. At 71, the retired structural engineer from Colorado had spent most of his life building things that defied nature, bridges across impossible gorges, towers that scraped the sky. But 12 years ago, when Margaret's cancer finally won its terrible war, the structures he'd built seemed meaningless against the one thing he couldn't engineer: more time with his wife, James Morrison. His college roommate from their days at Colorado State had called 6 months after the funeral. "Come to Spain," he'd said. "The reserve needs someone who understands boundaries." What James meant was the reserve needed someone who wouldn't cross them. Ethan had become their most reliable volunteer ranger, known for his strict adherence to the non-intervention policy. 8 years of watching, recording, never interfering. Margaret's photo and wedding ring hung on a chain beneath his uniform. The only rules he carried closer to his heart than the reserve's protocols. The reserve operated with a small but dedicated team. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, 45 and fiercely brilliant, served as head veterinarian while raising her teenage daughter alone. She was perhaps Ethan's only real friend here, the only one who knew why he sometimes stared too long at the horizon. James Morrison, now 68 and the reserve director, managed the delicate politics of conservation with the same charm that had gotten them through engineering school. Sarah Chen, 28 and hungry for the story that would launch her career, had arrived 3 months ago to document the reserve's 20th anniversary. And Miguel Santos, 52 years old with family roots in these hills going back centuries, supervised the ranger team with barely concealed resentment toward the American influence on Spanish soil. Then there were the animals. The reserve housed dozens of species, but none more magnificent than the Iberian cheetahs, a small population maintained through careful breeding programs. Among them moved a 6-year-old female the rangers had designated F7 in their logs. She was older for a wild cheetah, past her prime breeding years, mother to 3 cubs just 4 weeks old when this story began. The morning of day 0 began like any other. Ethan woke at 4:30 a.m., made his bitter coffee in the percolator Margaret had bought him 30 years ago, and checked the weather report. Clear skies, minimal wind, perfect conditions for his routine patrol of Section 7, the reserve's most remote quadrant. By 5 a.m., he was in his Jeep, the old diesel engine disturbing the pre-dawn silence as he headed toward the dried riverbed that marked the eastern boundary. Section 7 had always felt different from the rest of the reserve. The land here rolled in gentle waves, dotted with cork oaks and wild olive trees. It was where animals went when they wanted to disappear, where the boundary between managed conservation and true wilderness blurred. Ethan had driven this route hundreds of times, knew every rise and dip, every cluster of rocks where predators might rest. But this morning, something was wrong. The usual dawn chorus of birds hadn't started. No rustling in the underbrush from nocturnal creatures heading home. Even the ever-present insects had gone quiet. Ethan cut the engine and listened. Silence, except for his own breathing and heartbeat. Then he saw them vultures circling high above, maybe a quarter-mile ahead, but they weren't descending. Something was keeping them at bay. The discovery came as Ethan crested a small rise. There, near the dried riverbed where summer water had carved temporary pools, a shape that didn't belong. His binoculars revealed what his heart already suspected: a cheetah, collapsed on her side, barely moving. 3 tiny forms huddled against her, making sounds that carried on the still air. Cubs, no more than a month old, trying desperately to nurse from their unresponsive mother. Ethan's training kicked in immediately. Protocol was clear: observe, record, report. Do not approach. Do not interfere. Nature must take its course, no matter how brutal. He reached for his radio, then stopped. The cheetah's flank rose and fell shallow, labored breathing. She was alive, but barely. The cub's cries grew more insistent, more desperate. One, the smallest, had already given up trying to nurse and lay still against her mother's neck. "Reserve base. This is Ranger 7, he should have said. Should have reported the coordinates, requested guidance, waited for Elena and the veterinary team. Instead, Ethan found himself stepping out of the jeep, moving slowly toward the fallen animal. Each step was a violation of 8 years of perfect adherence to protocol. Each footfall a betrayal of the trust James had placed in him. The cheetah's eye opened as he approached Golden, exhausted, ancient. She made no attempt to flee or defend. Too weak, perhaps, or something else. Ethan had seen dying animals before, witnessed the fierce light that burned in them until the very end. This was different. This was surrender. But not to him, to something larger, some imperative that transcended species. "Hey there, Mama," he heard himself whisper, the words strange in the morning air. "What happened to you?" The decision that followed would haunt and define him. Ethan looked at the cubs, 2 females and one that appeared weaker than the others. All spotted fur and oversized paws. He thought of the rule book sitting in his glove compartment. Thought of Miguel, who would report this immediately. Thought of James, who had given him purpose when he'd had none. Then he thought of Margaret, lying in the hospice bed, whispering through cracked lips. "Sometimes, Ethan, rules are meant to guide us, not chain us. Sometimes doing the right thing means accepting the consequences." He made 3 trips. First, the cubs, surprisingly docile as he gathered them into a carrying crate he kept for injured birds. They weighed almost nothing, all fur and bird bones. Second, supplies from his Jeep blankets, water, the emergency kit every ranger carried. Finally, the hardest part: the mother herself. She must have weighed 60 pounds, maybe 70. Dead weight in his 71-year-old arms as he struggled to lift her. She made one sound as he carried her, not a growl or cry of pain, but something softer, almost like a sigh. Her head lolled against his chest. And for a moment, Ethan felt the strange sensation of being trusted by something wild. He managed to get her into the back of the Jeep, arranged on the blankets with her cubs pressed against her for warmth. Only after he'd started the engine did he reach for the radio. "Base, this is Ranger 7. I'm bringing in an emergency case. Adult female cheetah and 3 cubs. Prepare the medical facility." The radio crackled. Miguel's voice, sharp with suspicion. "Did you say bringing in Ethan? What have you done?" Ethan turned off the radio and drove toward the consequences. Elena Rodriguez was already waiting at the medical facility when Ethan arrived, her face a mixture of concern and disbelief. She'd prepared the examination room despite the protocol breach, her medical instincts overriding administrative concerns. Miguel stood beside her, arms crossed, his disapproval radiating like heat from pavement. "Jesus, Ethan," Elena breathed as they transferred the cheetah onto the examination table. "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking she was dying," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I was thinking 3 cubs would die with her." Elena's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs, drawing blood, examining the cheetah from nose to tail. The cubs huddled in a warming box, their tiny cries filling the sterile room. Miguel paced near the door, occasionally muttering in Spanish about Americans and their savior complexes. "Temperature's low, but not critical," Elena reported, moving her stethoscope across the cheetah's chest. Heart rate elevated but steady, no visible wounds, no signs of snakebite or poisoning. She palpated the abdomen carefully, her frown deepening. "No internal injuries I can detect." "Then what's wrong with her?" Ethan asked, stroking one of the cubs that had crawled toward his hand. Elena continued her examination, checking the cheetah's teats. She paused, pressed again, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something like sorrow. "She's not producing milk. Severe lactation failure. These cubs have been trying to nurse from empty wells for days, maybe longer." "But why?" Miguel demanded. "Disease infection." "No," Elena said quietly, reading the preliminary blood work. "She's malnourished. Severely. She's been starving herself." She looked up at Ethan, her eyes reflecting years of witnessing nature's cruel mathematics. "She's choosing death, Ethan. When a mother can't produce milk and can't hunt effectively with cubs this young, sometimes they just give up. They save their energy for one last effort to find help or safety for their offspring. Then they let go." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He saw Margaret suddenly, clearly, refusing the feeding tube, pushing away the nutritional supplements, saving every penny of their retirement for things that would outlast her. The parallel was so perfect it made him dizzy. "We can save her, though," he said, his voice rough. "IV fluids, nutrition, hormone therapy for the lactation." "We can try," Elena agreed, already starting an IV line. "But Ethan, you know what you've done. This isn't a medical issue anymore. It's political." As if summoned by her words, the door burst open. James Morrison stood there, his usually composed face flushed with anger. Behind him, Sarah Chen held her camera, documenting everything with the hungry eyes of someone who smelled a story. "What the hell?" "Ethan," James's voice filled the room. 8 years. 8 years of perfect compliance. And you throw it away for what, one cheetah? One mother, Ethan corrected quietly. 3 cubs. "I don't care if it was the last breeding pair on Earth," James snapped. "We have protocols for a reason. You've undermined everything we've built here." Elena cleared her throat. "James, there's something you should see." She had been examining the cheetah's left hind leg, where old scar tissue formed a distinctive pattern. She pulled up a tablet, scrolling through archived medical records. 4 years ago, we treated a young female cheetah caught in a poacher's wire snare. Severe laceration to the left hind leg, distinctive scarring pattern. She held the tablet next to the unconscious cheetah's leg. The match was unmistakable. "This is her," Elena continued, pulling up the full record. "F7 in our system, released after 6 weeks of treatment." She scrolled to the treatment notes. "Primary ranger on the rescue Ethan Calloway." The room went silent except for the soft beeping of monitors and the cubs' occasional mewls. Sarah's camera clicked rapidly. "She remembered you," Elena said softly. "That's why she didn't flee when you approached. She came back to the one human she trusted." Ethan stared at the cheetah at Grace, as he was already thinking of her. 4 years ago, she'd been barely more than a cub herself, terrified and bleeding, snapping at anyone who came close, except him. Something about his quiet manner, his refusal to rush, had calmed her. He'd spent hours just sitting near her cage, reading Margaret's old letters aloud, until she'd stopped seeing him as a threat. "This changes nothing," James said. But his voice had lost some of its edge. "If anything, it makes it worse. You've created an unnatural dependency." "The dependency was created 4 years ago," Miguel interjected, surprising everyone. "By our intervention, then. The question now is responsibility." "The question now," James corrected, "is damage control." He pulled out his phone. "Emergency board meeting in 1 hour. Sarah, I'm going to have to ask you to document everything, Sarah suggested, her smile sharp. Already on it. This is the story of the decade. Reserve Ranger breaks sacred protocol to save Cheetah who remembered him. It writes itself. You can't publish without permission, James warned. Actually, I can, Sarah replied. My contract gives me editorial independence for anything witnessed during my residency. But don't worry, Dr. Morrison. I'm interested in the full story, not a hit piece. Elena had been working steadily during the argument, hooking up IV bags, administering medications. The smallest cub had been placed on the mother's chest, and surprisingly, Grace's paw had moved slightly to cover it. She's stabilizing, Elena reported. But recovery will take time, days, maybe weeks, and the cubs need immediate intervention formula feeding, round-the-clock care. I'll do it, Ethan said immediately. You'll do nothing until the board decides your fate, James said coldly. 1 hour. Ethan, conference room. You better have a damn good explanation ready. He stormed out, Miguel following after a long look at Ethan. Sarah lingered, snapping photos of Ethan's hand resting on Grace's flank. Why? She asked quietly. Really? Not the official answer you'll give the board. Why? Ethan thought of Margaret's final days, of choices made from love rather than logic. Because 40 years ago, my wife told me that the measure of a person isn't in the rules they follow, but in knowing when to break them. I've been following rules for 12 years since she died. Today, I finally heard her voice again. Sarah lowered her camera. For once, she had no response. The next hour would determine everything: Ethan's position at the reserve, Grace's fate, the cub's survival. As Elena worked to stabilize her patient, Ethan sat beside the examination table, one hand on Grace's still form, the other holding the smallest cub. Through the window, the Spanish sun climbed higher, indifferent to human protocols and animal suffering alike. Stay with me, Mama, he whispered to Grace. We've got unfinished business. You and I. Grace's ear twitched slightly, as if she heard him, as if she agreed. Days 4 to 7, the vigil. The board had given Ethan 72 hours, 3 days to stabilize Grace and prove this intervention was justified, or face permanent removal from the reserve. James had delivered the verdict with the exhaustion of someone forced to choose between friendship and principle. Miguel had abstained from voting, which felt like its own kind of judgment. But none of that mattered to Ethan as he settled into the medical facility's recovery room on the evening of day 3. Grace lay on a padded platform, IVs delivering fluids and nutrients her body desperately needed. The cubs were in an incubator nearby, tiny bellies full of formula, but their cries constant. They wanted their mother, not rubber nipples and synthetic milk. Ethan pulled a camping chair next to Grace's platform and prepared for what would become his vigil. You need to go home, Elena said, checking monitors before her night shift ended. I've got staff watching her. No, Ethan replied simply. She came to me. I stay. Elena didn't argue. She'd learned to recognize the particular stubbornness of those who'd lost everything except their sense of duty. She left him with blankets and a thermos of coffee, knowing he wouldn't use either. The first night was the hardest. Grace wouldn't accept food, turning her head away from every offering. The cubs' formula feeding was mechanical. They drank because instinct demanded it, but without enthusiasm. Ethan found himself talking to fill the silence, his voice rough from disuse. He told Grace about the reserve, about the safe territory waiting for her recovery. But as the night deepened, the stories changed. Margaret loved cats, he said, surprising himself with the admission. Never had one. I was allergic, but she'd stop to pet every stray. Said they understood dignity better than most humans. He paused, watching Grace's chest rise and fall. She would have loved you. Would have said you were too proud to die like this. Day 5 brought crisis. The smallest cub, the one Ethan couldn't help but think of as the fighter, developed aspiration pneumonia from improper formula feeding. Elena worked through the morning to save her. Antibiotics and oxygen and prayer. Grace seemed to sense the danger, her eyes tracking the incubator where her baby fought for breath. She needs to eat, Elena said, exhaustion making her blunt. If she sees strength, maybe she'll find her own. Ethan tried everything. Fresh gazelle meat from the reserve's managed herds, liver, rich with nutrients, even live prey. Though it went against every safety protocol, Grace watched it all with dull eyes, unmoved. The depression of a mother who'd failed her most essential purpose was absolute. On the evening of day 6, Ethan broke. He'd been awake for nearly 40 hours, his body screaming for rest he wouldn't grant. Grace's breathing had grown shallower, and the smallest cub's fever spiked despite medication. He found himself on his knees beside her platform, his hand resting on her prominent ribs. "Please," he whispered, and wasn't sure if he was talking to Grace, to Margaret, or to God. "Please don't make me watch this again. I can't lose another one to giving up." He started talking about Margaret's final week, words he'd never spoken aloud. How she'd stopped eating not from illness, but from decision. How he'd begged, raged, bargained. How she'd taken his hand and said, "Sometimes, my love, the greatest courage is knowing when to stop fighting." "But not you," he told Grace fiercely. "You don't get to stop. Those babies need you. And maybe I need you too, to prove that not everything I touch has to die." Grace's eye opened, fixed on him. Slowly, painfully, she lifted her head. When Ethan offered water in his cupped palm, not a bowl, not a bottle, but his own weathered hand, she drank. 3 laps. Then exhaustion took her back down. But she drank. Elena, watching from the doorway, felt tears she couldn't explain. Days 8-11. The connection. The breakthrough with water became the foundation for recovery. Grace began accepting small pieces of meat, but only from Ethan's hand. It was as if she'd decided to trust this one human completely, or not at all. The smallest cub privately. Ethan had started calling her Hope, recovered from her pneumonia, though she remained fragile. Her sisters, stronger and more demanding, he thought of as Faith and Promise. Though he'd never speak the names aloud, it felt too much like ownership, and Grace owned herself. On day 8, something remarkable happened. Ethan had been bottle-feeding the cubs while Grace watched, 2 weeks still to nurse. Hope finished her formula and crawled toward her mother, mewing plaintively. Grace struggled to lift her paw to pull the cub close, but couldn't manage it. Without thinking, Ethan picked up Hope and placed her against Grace's chest. Grace's eyes met his, and she did something that would haunt him forever. She blinked slowly, the feline gesture of absolute trust. From that moment, Grace allowed him to handle her cubs freely. More than allowed, she seemed to expect it. When feeding time came, she'd look at him, then at the cubs, the message clear: "You're part of this now." Sarah Chen captured these moments with the hunger of someone who knew they were witnessing history. Her photos, Ethan's weathered hands cradling spotted cubs, Grace's paw resting on his arm as he fed her. The 4 of them curled together in afternoon sun began appearing online despite James's attempts at media blackout. The response was immediate and divisive. Hashtag Save Grace began trending, with thousands sharing the images, calling Ethan a hero, demanding the reserve support his efforts. But hashtag Let Nature Decide pushed back hard. Conservation purists arguing this was exactly the kind of sentimental interference that damaged legitimate conservation efforts. The reserve's social media flooded with praise and condemnation in equal measure. "You're famous," Sarah told Ethan on day 10, showing him her phone. A video of him sleeping in his chair while Grace's tail wrapped around his wrist had garnered 3 million views in 12 hours. "I don't want to be famous," Ethan replied, not looking at the screen. "I want her to live." But fame had found them regardless. News crews gathered at the reserve's gates. Donations poured in, some designated for Grace's care, others withdrawn in protest. James fielded calls from conservation organizations worldwide, some offering support, others threatening to pull funding if the circus continued. Ethan remained oblivious to most of it. His world had shrunk to the recovery room, to the daily victories of Grace eating another ounce of meat, of Hope gaining weight, of Faith and Promise playing with increasing vigor. He didn't know that Elena had been documenting everything with scientific rigor, that her notes on interspecies bonding were already being reviewed by veterinary journals. On day 11, Grace stood on her own for the first time, shaky but determined. She walked the 3 steps to where Ethan sat with her cubs and did something that made Elena grab her camera. She deposited each cub at his feet, then lay down beside them. Her body curved protectively around both her offspring and the man who'd saved them. Days 12 to 14. Recovery signs. The change came like dawn, gradual, then sudden. Day 12 began with Grace eating without coaxing, taking meat from the bowl rather than requiring hand feeding. Her milk production hadn't returned. Elena said it likely never would, but she'd accepted the cubs' formula feeding as necessary, even helping position them for Ethan to feed. "She's mothering again," Elena observed, watching Grace groom Promise with focused attention. "The depression's lifting." More remarkably, Grace had begun displaying protective behaviors, but selectively. When Elena approached, Grace watched carefully but permitted contact. When Sarah came with her camera, Grace would position herself between the cubs and the lens, allowing photos but maintaining control. But when Miguel entered on day 13 to check the facilities, Grace's transformation was instant, ears flat, teeth bared, a low growl that raised primitive fears. "She's categorizing," Elena said, fascinated. "Safe humans versus threats. She's teaching the cubs that not all people are the same." The morning routine that emerged was unlike anything the reserve had documented. Grace would wake at dawn, check each cub with methodical attention, then look for Ethan. If he wasn't already present, she'd make a particular chirping sound, not the normal Cheetah vocabulary, but something unique, a call she used only for him. When he arrived, she'd perform what Elena called presenting, bringing each cub to him individually, allowing him to inspect them, then taking them back. "It's like she's sharing custody," Elena told James during his reluctant daily check-in. "I've never seen anything like it." "It's unnatural," James replied, but his voice lacked conviction. He'd watched the footage, seen the trust in Grace's eyes, the gentle way Ethan handled creatures that should have been wild. Day 14 brought an unexpected test. A thunderstorm rolled through, the first significant weather since Grace's rescue. The cubs panicked at the thunder, and Grace, still weak, struggled to comfort all 3. Without hesitation, Ethan lay down beside them on the platform, his body providing additional shelter and warmth. Grace not only accepted this, but actively positioned the cubs between them, creating a protective circle that Elena's overnight camera captured in infrared. 2 species, united in protecting the young. Days 15 to 18. The teaching behavior. What happened next changed everything the reserve understood about Cheetah intelligence and memory. Day 15 started normally feeding, grooming, the established routine. But when Elena brought in a new veterinary assistant to help with examinations, Grace did something unprecedented. She deliberately positioned herself between the stranger and Ethan, then demonstrated threat displays, hissing, raising her hair, baring teeth. Then she moved to Ethan's side and became calm, purring, relaxed. She repeated this pattern 3 times, her eyes fixed on her cubs, who watched intently. The message was unmistakable. "This is danger. This is safety. Learn the difference." "She's using you as a teaching tool," Elena said, awestruck. "She's showing them how to identify safe humans." Sarah's footage from day 16 was even more remarkable. During feeding time, Grace deliberately knocked over the formula bottles when Sarah approached, but not when Ethan did. When the cubs tried to approach Sarah, Grace would gently but firmly redirect them to Ethan. She was programming them, creating associations that would last their lifetime. "This is unprecedented," Elena told the emergency board meeting on day 17. "We're not just seeing recovery. We're seeing active teaching of human differentiation." She's not humanizing them, she's teaching them a survival skill for living near human-populated areas. The implications were staggering and controversial. If cheetahs could teach their offspring to recognize specific humans as safe, it suggested a level of cognitive processing that challenged traditional understanding. It also raised ethical questions about the role of human intervention in wild animal behavior. Miguel, surprisingly, became an advocate. My grandfather told stories of wolves in these mountains that knew which shepherds would share food and which would shoot. Maybe we're not seeing something new, but something we've forgotten how to see. But the controversy exploded on day 18 when Sarah published her article, "The Cheetah Who Remembers How One Mother is Rewriting Conservation Rules." The piece, accompanied by her most powerful images, suggested that Grace's behavior indicated generational memory, that her trust of Ethan might have roots deeper than their first encounter 4 years ago. Elena's research had uncovered something remarkable in the reserve's archives. Grace's mother, a cheetah designated F2, had been one of the first animals treated at the reserve 20 years ago. The treating ranger's notes described an unusually calm cheetah who seemed to understand human intention. That ranger had been James Morrison's father, the reserve's founder. 3 generations, Elena explained to a skeptical James. 3 generations of cheetahs who've had positive human contact at critical moments. Grace isn't just remembering Ethan from 4 years ago. She's carrying genetic or cultural memory of humans as potential allies. "That's impossible," James said, but he was watching the monitor showing Grace and Ethan sitting peacefully together, the cubs playing between them. "So is a wild cheetah choosing a human as co-parent," Elena replied. "Yet here we are." The teaching behavior continued and intensified. Grace would demonstrate hunting postures with Ethan as the prey, but always ending with friendly contact, showing the cubs that this particular prey wasn't really prey at all. She'd practice defensive maneuvers with him as the threat, but always breaking into play, teaching them that his threat was performance, not reality. Most remarkably, she began bringing Ethan objects: a stick, a feather, small stones, and waiting for him to hide them. Then she'd encourage the cubs to search, using it as training for tracking skills. But she'd only do this with Ethan. When Elena tried to participate, Grace would take the object away and return it to Ethan. "She's chosen him," Elena said simply. "Not as a mate, not as a parent, but as something we don't have a word for. A trusted other, a bridge between worlds." By day 18's end, the reserve faced a decision that would define its future. Grace was physically recovered enough for release. The cubs were thriving. Traditional protocol demanded they be returned to the wild immediately, before bonds deepened further. But nothing about this situation was traditional. James stood in the observation room, watching Ethan read to Grace from one of Margaret's books while the cubs played with his bootlaces. Sarah stood beside him, camera lowered for once. "What are you going to do?" she asked. James was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. For 30 years, we've said our job is to maintain the boundary between human and wild. But what if the boundary isn't where we thought it was? What if it's not a wall but a membrane, permeable under the right conditions?" "That's poetic," Sarah said. "But is it science? Ask me in 6 months." James replied, "If they're all still alive and wild, maybe it's both." Outside, the Spanish sun set over the reserve, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. In the recovery room, a man who'd lost everything and a cheetah who'd almost lost everything sat in comfortable silence, while 3 small lives played between them, bridging 2 worlds with every heartbeat. Days 19 to 21, release preparation. The board's decision came down on the morning of day 19 with the weight of inevitable judgment. James delivered it personally, his face carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd fought a battle he wasn't sure he wanted to win. 48 hours, he said, standing in the doorway of the recovery room where Ethan sat with Grace and her cubs. The board voted 6-3. Grace returns to the wild by day 21. No extensions, no exceptions. Ethan didn't look up from where Hope was trying to catch his finger with her tiny paws. "She's not ready." Elena says she is. Physically recovered, hunting instincts intact, cubs thriving. James moved closer, his voice softening. "Ethan, you knew this was coming. This was always temporary. The cubs are still formula feeding. Grace hasn't hunted. She hasn't even left this room voluntarily. Because you haven't let her, James replied, and there was accusation in his tone. You've created a dependency that shouldn't exist. Every day makes it worse. Grace lifted her head at the tension in their voices, her eyes moving between the two men. She made the unique chirping sound she used only for Ethan, and he automatically responded by stroking her head. James watched this interaction with something between wonder and worry. My father would have been fascinated by this, he admitted. He always said the reserve's mission wasn't to separate human and wild, but to find sustainable coexistence. But Ethan, this isn't coexistence. This is... What? Ethan challenged, finally meeting his eyes. What is it? James? I don't know, James admitted. That's what scares me. The preparation began that afternoon. Elena supervised the construction of a large temporary enclosure at the release site, 5 acres of prime hunting ground at the reserve's center, far from human activity. The plan was graduated freedom first, the enclosure to test Grace's hunting abilities, then full release if she proved capable. We need to start weaning the cubs off formula, Elena told Ethan as they prepared for the transition. Grace needs to see them eating meat, acting like wild cheetahs. They're 7 weeks old, Ethan protested. That's too early. In the wild, they'd be starting on regurgitated meat now. We're already behind schedule. Elena's voice was gentle, but firm. Ethan, you have to start letting go. The words echoed Margaret's doctor 13 years ago, the same gentle insistence that love meant knowing when to release. Ethan found himself mechanically following Elena's instructions, teaching the cubs to tear at meat strips, watching Grace observe with interest as her babies began acting like predators instead of pets. Sarah documented everything with unusual solemnity. Her typical hunger for the story had evolved into something more respectful, more aware of the weight of what she was witnessing. How do you do it, Brown? She asked Ethan the evening of day 20. How do you love something knowing you have to let it go? Ethan was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, while watching Grace clean Promise's face with maternal precision, he said, My wife taught me that love isn't measured in time but in depth. A moment of real connection can outweigh years of proximity. Grace and I, we've had our moment. Maybe that's enough. You don't believe that, Sarah observed. No, Ethan admitted. But I'm trying to... Day 21 dawned gray and humid, unusual for the season. Grace seemed to sense the change, pacing the recovery room with restless energy. The cubs responded to her mood, their play more aggressive, their calls more wild. When Ethan entered with their morning formula, Grace did something she'd never done before. She blocked him from the cubs, gently but firmly. She knows, Elena said, watching from the doorway. Somehow, she knows something's changing. The transport arrangements were elaborate. A specialized trailer designed for big cats, ventilated and cushioned, with space for Grace and all 3 cubs. Miguel would drive. Elena would monitor. James would supervise. Ethan was initially told he couldn't participate, emotional attachment compromising judgment, but Grace's increasing agitation changed that decision. She'll panic without him, Elena argued to James. We need this to go smoothly, not traumatically. So Ethan found himself in the trailer with Grace as they made the short journey to the release site. She pressed against him, her body trembling not with fear but with something else, some deep recognition of transition. The cubs huddled between them, picking up on their mother's energy. It's okay, Mama, Ethan whispered, his hand on her neck, feeling her pulse race. You're going home. Your real home? Grace turned her head to look at him. And in her golden eyes, he saw something that broke his heart. She understood him. Not the words, but the meaning. The goodbye, underneath the comfort. Day 22. First release. Attempt. The morning of release came with perfect weather, as if nature itself wanted to welcome Grace home. The temporary enclosure stretched before them, 5 acres of grassland dotted with acacia trees, a small stream running through its center. A small herd of impala grazed at the far end, unaware they were part of the reintegration plan. The entire staff had gathered, along with Sarah and her camera, several board members, and surprisingly, a handful of reporters who'd somehow gotten word. James tried to maintain order, but there was an electric feeling in the air. History being made or unmade. The plan was simple. Open the trailer, let Grace exit at her own pace, then monitor from a distance. The enclosure would be her home for at least a week, allowing observation of her hunting skills and maternal behavior without human interference. If successful, the fence would come down and she'd be truly free. Remember, James addressed Ethan directly, once she's out, no interaction. We watch from outside the fence only. Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice. He positioned himself at the trailer door, Grace and the cubs waiting behind him. His hand on the release handle felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. On your count, Elena said softly. Ethan pulled the handle. The door swung open, revealing the expanse of semi-wild space. For a moment, nothing moved. Then promise. The boldest of the cubs padded forward, sniffing the air. Faith followed. Then hope, their spotted forms tiny against the vast grassland. Grace emerged slowly, majestically, her muscles rippling under her coat. She stood at the trailer's edge, surveying her domain. The gathered humans held their breath. This was the moment would she run for freedom, gather her cubs and disappear into the landscape as a wild cheetah should. She walked forward 10 paces, 20, the cubs tumbling after her. 50 meters from the trailer, she stopped. Her head turned back toward Ethan, who stood frozen by the empty trailer. She made the chirping sound, their sound, and waited. Don't respond, James warned under his breath. Grace called again, louder. The cubs, picking up on her distress, began mewing. She took a step back toward the trailer, then another. No, Elena breathed. She needs to go forward. But Grace had made her decision. With increasing speed, she returned to the trailer, cubs scrambling to keep up. She walked directly to Ethan, pressed her head against his leg, and stood there, trembling. Get in the trailer, James ordered. Now, Ethan, get in, and we'll drive away. Ethan climbed into the trailer. Grace immediately followed, cubs in tow. The moment he sat down, she lay beside him, her body pressed against his, the cubs climbing over both of them. She won't leave him, Elena said, stating the obvious. She's chosen captivity with him over freedom without him. Miguel, unexpectedly, laughed. It was bitter and sad. She's ruined. A wild animal that won't be wild. This is what your American sentimentality creates. Shut up, Miguel, Sarah snapped, her camera capturing Grace's refusal to leave Ethan's side. They tried twice more that day. Each time, Grace would exit the trailer, survey the enclosure, then return to Ethan. The third time, she simply refused to leave at all, positioning herself between him and the door, her message clear where he went. She went. As the sun set on their failed release, James stood with Ethan outside the trailer where Grace and her cubs rested. I don't know what to do, James admitted. We can't force her. Tranquilizing and abandoning her would be cruel and probably fatal. She'd just try to find her way back. But we can't keep a wild cheetah as a pet. She's not a pet, Ethan said firmly. She's something else. Something we don't have protocols for. Then we need to create them, Elena interjected, joining them. Because this is bigger than one cheetah. If Grace's behavior is learned, if it can be passed on, we're looking at a fundamental shift in how we understand human-wildlife relationships. Days 23 to 25. The standoff. The failed release became international news overnight. #GraceChoosesLove trended globally, with millions debating whether her behavior represented beautiful interspecies connection or tragic human interference. The reserve's phone rang constantly, journalists, scientists, animal rights activists, all demanding answers no one had. Day 23 brought an emergency board meeting that devolved into chaos. Half the board demanded forced relocation, tranquilize Grace, move her hundreds of miles away, let instinct overcome attachment. The other half argued this was cruel and likely futile. "We're a conservation reserve, not a zoo," argued Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the board's senior member. "Our credibility depends on maintaining professional boundaries." "Our credibility depends on animal welfare," countered Thomas Drake, the newest member. "Forcing separation that causes clear distress violates our core principles." Ethan wasn't invited to the meeting but sat outside, Grace's cubs playing at his feet. Elena had brought them to him when Grace began showing signs of severe anxiety, pacing, calling, refusing food. The moment the cubs were with Ethan, Grace calmed. "She trusts you with them completely," Elena observed. "That's not dependency, that's delegation." Sarah published her second major article that day, "The Ranger Who Broke Nature's Rules and Maybe Discovered New Ones." It included a photograph that would become iconic, Ethan sitting cross-legged with the 3 cubs sleeping in his lap while Grace watched from the trailer, her expression serene. The article triggered something unexpected. Donations flooded in, specifically designated for Grace's care. A wildlife sanctuary in Kenya offered to take all of them, Ethan included, to study this unique bond. Several universities requested access for research. The story had transcended local drama to become a global phenomenon, but it also attracted criticism. Traditional conservationists condemned the anthropomorphization of wildlife. A prominent biologist published a scathing editorial calling the situation Disney conservation that undermined serious efforts to preserve wild populations. Day 24 brought protesters to the reserve's gates. 2 distinct groups, those demanding Grace's freedom and those insisting she'd chosen her own path. The confrontation grew heated. Police were called, and suddenly the reserve was on every evening news program in Europe. James found Ethan that evening in the medical facility. Grace finally calm with her cubs after the day's chaos. "The board wants you gone," James said without preamble. "Immediate termination. Lifetime ban from the reserve. They think if you leave, Grace will adapt." "She won't," Ethan replied quietly. "We both know that." "I know." James sat heavily in Elena's chair. 40 years of friendship. Ethan. 4 decades, and it comes down to this, choosing between you and everything my father built. "Your father would have understood," Ethan said. "He saved Grace's grandmother. Didn't he? The first cheetah treated here?" James looked up sharply. "How did you know about that?" "Elena found the records, F1 20 years ago. Your father spent 6 weeks with her, hand-feeding, building trust. The notes say she remembered him for years after release, would appear at the reserve's edge when he was on duty." "That was different," James protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Was it the beginning of something we're only now understanding? Day 25 brought resolution from an unexpected source. Elena had been running additional tests on Grace's blood work, looking for any medical explanation for her behavior. What she found changed everything. "Genetic markers," she announced to the emergency assembly of board, staff, and media. "Grace carries specific genetic markers associated with domestication syndrome in other species, neural crest cell variations that affect behavior, stress response, and social bonding." "Are you saying she's domesticated?" Patricia Hoffman demanded. "No. I'm saying she's genetically predisposed to forming interspecies bonds. It's not unnatural, it's her nature. And," Elena paused for effect, "these markers are hereditary. Her cubs will carry them too." The implications were staggering. Grace wasn't an anomaly, but potentially the beginning of a subspecies wild cheetahs capable of coexistence with humans in ways previously thought impossible. "This is evolution in real time," Elena continued. "Human presence has been selecting for animals that can adapt to our proximity. Grace represents successful adaptation, not failure." Miguel, silent until now, stood. "My grandfather's stories," he said slowly. "The wolves that knew which humans to trust. Maybe they weren't stories. Maybe they were observations of something that's always existed, but we stopped seeing when we decided wild meant separate." Sarah was typing furiously, already composing her next headline. But she paused to ask the crucial question. So what happens now? James looked at Grace, at Ethan, at the cubs playing between them. Now we write new protocols, ones that acknowledge that the divide between human and wild might not be a wall but a bridge. And sometimes, he looked directly at Ethan, bridges need guardians on both sides. The standoff was over, but the real challenge, defining what Grace and Ethan represented and how to honor it while preserving wildness, had just begun. As the sun set on day 25, Grace lay with her cubs while Ethan read from Margaret's journal, their strange family existing in a space between worlds that had no name but love. Days 26 to 28, the illness. The morning of day 26 began with deceptive normalcy. Grace had finally accepted her modified routine mornings in the enclosure, with Ethan observing from just outside the fence. Afternoons in the medical facility for the cubs' continued formula supplementation. It was an imperfect solution, but it was working. Until Hope began to wheeze. The smallest of the three cubs had always been fragile, where faith and promise tumbled and played with increasing vigor. Hope tired quickly, preferring to stay close to Grace or Ethan. Elena had been monitoring her closely, noting slower weight gain and occasional lethargy, but nothing that suggested immediate danger. The wheeze started during morning feeding. Ethan noticed at first a slight rattle as Hope breathed, barely audible. By noon, it was pronounced. By evening, the cub was struggling, her tiny chest working harder with each breath. Aspiration pneumonia, Elena diagnosed, her stethoscope against Hope's heaving ribs. She must have inhaled some formula. With her weaker constitution. She didn't finish the sentence. Grace's reaction was immediate and devastating. She gathered Hope against her chest, grooming her obsessively, trying to clean away whatever was stealing her baby's breath. When that didn't work, she did something that stunned everyone watching. She picked up Hope by the scruff and carried her to Ethan, depositing the cub at his feet with a desperate chirp. "She's asking for help," Elena breathed. "She knows we have medicine." Ethan gathered Hope gently, feeling the heat of fever through her spotted fur, the labored rise and fall of her tiny chest. Grace watched him intently, her eyes holding a trust that felt like a physical weight. The treatment began immediately: antibiotics, nebulizer treatments, subcutaneous fluids. Hope was too small for IV access, making everything more challenging. Elena worked with methodical precision while Ethan held the cub. Grace pressed against his side, her anxiety palpable. "She needs round-the-clock care," Elena explained as she prepared medications. "Treatments every 4 hours, monitoring for any deterioration. And Ethan..." She paused, choosing words carefully. "Grace needs to understand she has 2 other cubs. In the wild. She'd have to make a choice." The choice presented itself on day 27. Faith and Promise, deprived of their mother's full attention, began showing signs of distress. They needed to nurse. The formula wasn't enough anymore, and Grace's milk had finally begun to return in small amounts. But Grace wouldn't leave Hope, wouldn't even look at her healthy cubs. "She's going to lose all of them at this rate," Miguel observed, watching from the doorway. His usual criticism had been replaced by something softer. "In nature, she'd abandon the sick one." "We're not in nature," Ethan replied, exhausted from a sleepless night of nebulizer treatments. "We're somewhere else. Somewhere between." That evening, Grace made her choice. She brought Faith and Promise to Ethan, nudging them toward him with her nose, then returned to Hope's side. The message was clear. "You feed them. I'll stay with her." So Ethan became surrogate mother to 2 cubs, while their real mother focused on the one who needed her most. He fed Faith and Promise, played with them, even attempted the grooming that Cheetah mothers provided, all while Grace watched Hope breathe. Day 28 saw slight improvement. Hope's fever broke at dawn, and her breathing eased marginally. Grace finally ate a few bites of meat, though her eyes never left her smallest cub. Elena allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. "The antibiotics are working," she reported to James, who'd been monitoring the situation with growing concern. "But she's not out of danger." Secondary infections. Organ damage from the fever the next 48 hours are critical. Sarah had been documenting everything with uncharacteristic restraint. She took photos but didn't publish them. Recorded video but kept it private. When Ethan asked why, she said simply, "Some moments are too private for the world. This is a mother watching her baby fight for life. That's sacred, regardless of species." Days 29 to 30. The crisis. Hope's improvement was an illusion. Day 29 brought a cascade of complications. The infection had spread to her bloodstream. Her kidneys were struggling, and despite aggressive treatment, she was fading. Elena called in Dr. Marcus Webb, the reserve's consulting veterinary specialist, but even he could only offer marginally different approaches. "She's septic," he explained to Ethan, who hadn't left the medical facility in 3 days. "In a cub this small, with her existing vulnerabilities. I'm sorry, but you should prepare yourself." Grace seemed to understand. She'd stopped grooming Hope obsessively, instead just holding her close, as if trying to transfer her own life force to her dying cub. Faith and Promise, sensing the gravity, had stopped their playful behavior, huddling together in the corner Ethan had prepared for them. The crisis deepened when Grace stopped eating entirely. Not the reluctant picking at food she'd done before, but complete refusal. She wouldn't even drink water unless Ethan held it to her lips, and then only a few laps. "She's giving up again," Elena said, exhaustion making her blunt. "Just like before, but worse. She knows Hope is dying." Ethan found himself caught in an impossible situation. Faith and Promise needed constant care with their mother incapacitated. Hope required medical attention every few hours. Grace needed emotional support he didn't know how to provide. And his own body, 71 years old and running on no sleep for 72 hours, was failing. "Let me help," Sarah offered on the morning of day 30, setting down her camera. "Show me how to feed the cubs." It was Miguel who surprised everyone. The man who'd opposed everything about this situation arrived with a camping cot and supplies. "You need rest," he told Ethan gruffly. 10 minutes here and there, or you'll collapse and help no one." Even James appeared, his administrative duties abandoned. He sat with Grace while Ethan took a desperately needed hour of sleep, talking to her quietly about his father, about the reserve's history, about the continuity of life even in loss. But Hope continued to decline. Her breathing became more labored, her responses to stimuli weaker. Elena increased medications, tried experimental treatments, even consulted with pediatric veterinarians who worked with domestic cats. Nothing stopped the inexorable slide. The afternoon of day 30 brought the worst moment yet. Hope seized her tiny body convulsing while Grace cried out in distress, a sound that brought everyone running. Elena administered anticonvulsants, but the damage was clear. The infection had reached Hope's brain. "Hours," Elena told Ethan quietly. "Maybe less." Grace heard or understood. She pulled Hope tight against her chest and began a low, continuous purr, the sound mother cats make to comfort dying kittens, a vibration of love that transcends species. Faith and Promise crept closer, adding their small voices to their mother's lament. Day 31. The breaking point. Hope died at 3:47 a.m. on day 31. Ethan was holding her when it happened, Grace's head resting on his lap, her eyes fixed on her cub's face. The tiny chest that had fought so hard for each breath simply stopped. No drama, no final struggle, just stillness where motion had been. Grace's reaction was immediate and devastating. She nudged Hope with her nose, trying to wake her. When that failed, she began grooming the still form frantically, as if she could clean death away. Then came the sound that would haunt everyone who heard it, a keening wail that seemed to come from the earth itself, grief given voice in its purest form. The cry woke the entire compound. Faith and Promise added their confused mews. Even the other animals in nearby enclosures responded, creating a chorus of lamentation that rolled across the reserve like a wave. Ethan broke completely. For 12 years since Margaret's death, he'd held himself together through will and routine. He'd cried at her funeral. Yes, but controlled tears, dignified grief. This was different. This was the complete shattering of a man who'd thought he had no tears left to give. He sobbed great, gasping sobs that shook his entire frame. For hope, for Margaret, for Grace, for every loss that compounds into the unbearable weight of living. His tears fell on Grace's fur, on Hope's still form, on Faith and Promise, who pressed against him in confusion. Grace stopped her keening in the midst of her own devastating loss. She did something that defined everything she was. She placed her paw on Ethan's hand, not seeking comfort, but offering it. Two beings who'd lost what couldn't be replaced, sharing a grief that needed no translation. Elena found them like that an hour later, Ethan and Grace curled around Hope's body, Faith and Promise tucked between them, all crying in their own ways. She started to speak, to offer to remove Hope's body, but stopped. This was ceremony, as ancient and necessary as any human funeral. Sarah stood in the doorway, camera in her hands. She raised it once, then lowered it without taking a shot. Later, when asked why she didn't document this historic moment of interspecies grief, she said simply, "Because I'm human first, photographer second. Some pain is too pure for pixels." The sun rose on day 31 to find an unlikely family bound by loss. Grace finally allowed Elena to take Hope's body, but only after Ethan promised actually spoke the words aloud that she would be buried properly, not disposed of as medical waste. James arrived at noon with an ultimatum he didn't want to deliver. The board met in emergency session. They're moved by the situation, but the decision stands. Grace must be relocated tomorrow, with or without your cooperation. Tranquilization if necessary. Ethan looked at Grace, who was mechanically grooming Faith and Promise, her movements automatic rather than engaged. "You'd be killing her," he said quietly. "She's lost one cub and is grieving. Forced separation now would break her completely." "I know," James admitted, "but I'm out of options. The publicity, the controversy, it's destroying the reserve's credibility. We've lost 3 major donors this week." "Then you've lost me too," Ethan said, surprising himself with the clarity of decision. "I'll leave tomorrow. Resign, relocate, whatever you need. But I'm not participating in forced separation. Not after this." Grace lifted her head at his tone, looking between the two men. She gathered Faith and Promise closer. Her message clear whatever came next. They would face it together. Miguel, who'd been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "There's another way. But it would require admitting we don't have all the answers. That maybe the old ways and the new ways need to find middle ground." Everyone turned to look at him. The man who'd opposed Ethan's intervention from the beginning had something else in his eyes, now understanding, born from witnessing pure grief, transcends species boundaries. "What if," Miguel continued slowly, "we stop trying to force this into existing categories? What if Grace and Ethan are showing us a third option? Not wild, not captive, but something new." The day ended with Hope's burial in a small grove of cork oaks. Ethan dug the grave himself, his movements slow but determined. Grace watched from nearby, Faith and Promise huddled against her. When the small body was laid to rest, Grace approached, sniffed the disturbed earth, then did something remarkable. She scraped additional dirt over the grave with her paws, participating in the burial ritual. As the sun set on their day of loss, Ethan sat with Grace and her surviving cubs, all of them diminished by grief but somehow stronger in their shared sorrow. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, forced decisions, potential separation. But tonight, they simply existed in their pain together, proving that love and loss are universal languages that require no translation between species. The second plot twist, Elena's discovery. The morning after Hope's burial, while Ethan sat vigil with the grieving Grace, Elena worked feverishly in her laboratory. She'd been running additional genetic analyses on Grace's blood samples, searching for any biological explanation for the unprecedented bond between cheetah and human. What she found at 2 a.m. would revolutionize their understanding of conservation itself. "Ethan, James, You need to see this immediately, Elena called, her voice carrying an urgency that brought both men running despite the early hour. On her computer screen were complex genetic sequences, markers highlighted in different colors. To the untrained eye, it meant nothing. But Elena's expression suggested it meant everything. "I've found specific genetic markers in Grace's DNA," she began, her words tumbling over each other in excitement. "Markers associated with what we call domestication syndrome in other species, neural crest cell variations that affect behavior, stress response, and most importantly, social bonding capacity." James frowned. "Are you suggesting Grace is somehow domesticated?" "No," Elena said firmly. "I'm saying she carries genetic variations that make her naturally predisposed to forming interspecies bonds. It's not a defect or deviation, it's an adaptation. And here's the crucial part. These markers are hereditary." She pulled up another screen, showing a genealogical chart of the reserve's cheetahs. "I traced Grace's lineage through our breeding records. Her mother was F2, recorded as unusually calm during human interaction. Her grandmother," Elena paused dramatically, "was F1, also known as Phantom." The room fell silent. Every staff member knew the legend of Phantom, the reserve's first rescued cheetah, found near death 25 years ago by the reserve's founder, Dr. Morrison Sr. She'd recovered under his personal care and, even after release, would appear at the reserve's edges when he was on duty, maintaining a distant but consistent connection until her death at age 15. "My father," James whispered, staring at the screen. "He saved Grace's grandmother." "More than saved," Elena continued. "He spent 2 months hand-raising her. The connection they formed was so strong that Phantom taught her cubs to recognize him as safe. Those cubs passed that recognition to their offspring. Grace isn't exhibiting learned behavior, she's expressing inherited memory, genetic predisposition to trust specific human types who match certain behavioral patterns." Miguel, who'd been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. "The old stories from my grandfather wolves that knew which shepherds meant safety across generations. They weren't folklore. They were observations of evolution and progress." Elena nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. Human presence has been selecting for animals capable of coexistence for thousands of years. But we've been so focused on keeping wild and human separate that we've missed the evidence of successful adaptation happening right in front of us. Grace represents 3 generations of positive human contact at critical developmental moments," Elena explained. "Her genetics have been shaped by these interactions. She's not broken or tamed, she's evolved. And faith and promise carry these same markers. They're potentially the beginning of a new subspecies, wild cheetahs capable of controlled coexistence with humans." The third plot twist. The letter. Sarah Chen had spent the morning in Ethan's cabin with his permission, looking for photographs of Margaret to accompany her article about love transcending species. What she found instead changed everything. Hidden in a drawer beneath old engineering manuals was a leather journal. Margaret's handwriting filling pages with observations about the reserve, about Ethan, about her illness. Sarah almost put it back. Private grief wasn't her story to tell, but the final entry, dated just 2 weeks before Margaret's death, stopped her cold. She brought the journal to Elena's lab where Ethan, James, and Miguel were still processing Elena's genetic revelations. "Ethan," she said gently, "I found something you need to see." The final entry read, "My dearest Ethan, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're lost. I know you, my love. You'll bury yourself in routine and rules, afraid to feel again. So I've done something that might seem cruel but comes from love. There's a pregnant cheetah who hunts near the reserve's eastern boundary. I've been feeding her while you're on patrol, just enough to help her through these hard months. She's young, maybe first litter, and struggling. She comes to the old oak where we carved our initials that first year here. I know I'm creating a dependency. I know it's against everything the reserve stands for. But Ethan, when I'm gone, you'll need something to save. Someone who needs you as desperately as you'll need purpose. She'll come to you, this cheetah or her cubs, and when she does, remember sometimes love means breaking rules. Sometimes salvation comes on 4 legs. I can barely hold the pen now. But I needed you to know I'm not abandoning you. I'm leaving you a bridge back to life. Follow it. All my love, always. Margaret. The silence that followed was absolute. Ethan took the journal with shaking hands, reading his wife's words through tears. The dates aligned perfectly. Grace would have been born shortly after Margaret's death, possibly to a mother Margaret had been secretly supporting. She knew, Ethan whispered. Somehow, she knew. Elena quickly cross-referenced records. There were reports of a young female cheetah found dead near the eastern boundary 13 years ago, shortly after giving birth. Cause of death unknown. But 3 cubs were found nearby and brought to the reserve. One of them was Grace's mother. F2, James finished. The cheetah Margaret fed was Grace's grandmother, possibly Phantom herself in her final pregnancy. Sarah struggled to comprehend the implications. Are you saying Margaret orchestrated this, that she somehow knew Ethan would need Grace specifically? I'm saying, Elena replied carefully, that Margaret understood something we're only now recognizing, that the bonds between humans and animals aren't just emotional but can be generational, inherited, purposeful. She didn't orchestrate it. She recognized it and nurtured it. The decision reversal. James stood holding Margaret's journal, his 40-year friendship with Ethan warring with his administrative responsibilities. Then he made a decision that his father would have been proud of. Emergency board meeting, he announced. 1 hour. Everyone attends, including you. Ethan. The boardroom had never been so packed. All 9 board members, the senior staff, Sarah with her camera, even Miguel's grandfather, Don Carlos, who'd worked these lands for 80 years. James presented everything: Elena's genetic findings, Margaret's journal, the multi-generational connection between the Morrison and Calloway families, and this specific cheetah lineage. We've been operating under a false dichotomy, James argued. Wild or captive, separate or destroyed. But what if there's a third option? What if Grace and Ethan represent successful coevolution humans and wildlife, adapting to share space without losing their essential natures? Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the most traditional board member, surprised everyone by speaking first. My career has been built on maintaining boundaries between human and wild. But science means accepting evidence even when it challenges our assumptions. The genetic markers are undeniable. The behavioral patterns are documented. We're not looking at failure, we're witnessing evolution, Thomas Drake added. This could revolutionize conservation globally. Instead of just preserving wildlife in isolation, we could be developing protocols for sustainable coexistence. The vote was unanimous, unprecedented in the board's history. Grace would remain at the reserve under a new classification, transitional wildlife. Ethan would be granted official guardian status, not as owner, but as what Elena termed interspecies liaison. The reserve would develop new protocols acknowledging that the boundary between human and wild might be permeable under specific genetic and circumstantial conditions. Your father would be fascinated, Ethan told James after the vote. James smiled, the first genuine smile in days. He always said the reserve's mission wasn't to freeze nature in amber, but to help it adapt to a world where humans exist. Grace isn't a violation of that mission, she's its fulfillment. As the meeting concluded, Don Carlos, Miguel's grandfather, stood slowly. In accented English, he said, My grandfather told me stories of wolves that remembered kindness across generations. Everyone said he was a foolish old man. Today, you've proven he was a prophet. The decision made, protocols rewritten, and Grace's future secured. Ethan returned to where she waited with faith and promise. She greeted him with her unique chirp, and for the first time since Hope's death, she seemed present rather than just existing. Day 41. The true release. 10 days had passed since Hope's burial and the board's revolutionary decision. Grace had slowly emerged from her grief, though she kept faith and promise closer than before, rarely letting them venture more than a few feet away. The reserve had implemented what they called the Grace Protocol, a gradual transition to wildness that respected both natural instinct and formed bonds. The new approach was elegantly simple. Instead of forced separation or complete captivity, they installed a specialized gate in the enclosure fence one that Grace could open from either side by pressing a panel. But the cubs couldn't operate until they grew larger. The choice would always be hers. "We're not releasing her," Elena explained to the gathered staff and media on the morning of day 41. "We're giving her the option of freedom." Ethan stood 50 meters from the enclosure as Grace investigated the new gate. She sniffed it thoroughly, tested the panel with her paw, watched it swing open. Faith and Promise tumbled through after her, then back, treating it like a game. Grace looked toward Ethan, made her distinctive chirp, but he didn't respond. This had to be her decision alone. The first exploration lasted 12 minutes. Grace led her cubs through the gate into the broader reserve, sniffing the air, assessing threats and opportunities. Then she returned, settling in her familiar spot where she could see the medical facility. The gate remained open. Each day, she ventured farther. Day 43 saw her teaching the cubs to stalk birds. Day 45 brought their first successful hunt, a young rabbit that Grace caught and shared with Faith and Promise, their instincts awakening with each bite. But every evening, she returned, checking in at the enclosure as if confirming home still existed. Ethan maintained strict distance during these excursions, though it cost him. He watched through binoculars as Grace taught her daughters the art of being Cheetah, the patience before the sprint, the precise angle of attack, the economy of energy that meant survival. She was magnificent in her element, and he began to understand that loving her meant celebrating her wildness, not constraining it. 3 months later, the autumn rains had transformed the reserve into a paradise of green grass and full water holes. Grace had established a territory that centered on the enclosure but extended nearly 3 miles in each direction. Faith and Promise, now 6 months old and showing their mother's intelligent eyes, were proficient hunters of small prey. The morning ritual had evolved into something profound. Each dawn, Ethan would take his position on the eastern ridge, exactly 200 meters from Grace's favorite resting spot. She would appear with her daughters, pause on the opposite rise, and they would simply acknowledge each other across the distance. No calls, no approach, just the recognition that they both still existed in the same world. Sarah Chen, who'd extended her stay to document this unprecedented situation, had captured hundreds of these moments. Her book, The Distance Between a Story of Interspecies Love, was already in production, but the image that would define the story was unplanned. Miguel's grandfather, Don Carlos, had snapped it with an old film camera. It showed Ethan and Grace as tiny figures on opposite ridges, the vast Spanish landscape between them, but somehow obviously connected across the space. The reserve had become a pilgrimage site for conservationists, scientists, and curious tourists. The Grace Exception, as the protocol was now formally known, had been adopted by 3 other reserves experimenting with what they called compassionate conservation. Funding had not only recovered, but exceeded previous levels. "She's wild but aware," Elena published in her groundbreaking paper. She maintains natural behaviors while acknowledging human presence as non-threatening. Her cubs are learning both hunting skills and human recognition. This isn't domestication, it's coexistence. 6 months later, epilogue. Ethan's journal entry. December 25th. Christmas morning came with frost, unusual for southern Spain. I took my position at dawn, expecting nothing. Grace had been absent for 3 days, likely following prey migration. But she was there, Faith and Promise nearly as large as their mother now, all 3 watching me from their ridge. Then something extraordinary. Grace descended partway down her slope and left something on a prominent rock, a fresh kill. A young rabbit. A gift, perhaps, or simply coincidence. But I choose to believe Margaret was right. Love transcends species, transcends death, transcends understanding. I've learned something in these 6 months that 71 years hadn't taught me. Love isn't possession. It isn't proximity. It's the space between heartbeats where recognition lives. Grace and I see each other across 200 meters every morning. And in that seeing is everything gratitude, remembrance, continuation. Margaret knew I'd need something to save after she was gone. She didn't know that what needed saving was my capacity to let go. Grace taught me that. By choosing both wildness and connection, she showed me that love doesn't require presence, only acknowledgement. Faith and promise will have cubs someday. They'll carry genetic memories of kindness, biological tendencies toward trust, not domestication but adaptation, not captivity but coexistence. The world is changing, and perhaps creatures like Grace are evolution's answer, wild things that remember human kindness across generations. Some bonds are written not in words or laws, but in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, where wild things remember kindness and old men learn that salvation comes with 4 legs and spotted fur. Margaret was right about that too. She was right about everything. This morning, after Grace left her gift and returned to her ridge, she did something new. She sat facing my direction and began to groom Faith while Promise played nearby. Just a mother with her cubs, living her wild life, but choosing to do so where I could witness it. The greatest gift isn't the rabbit she left, but the trust she maintains, wild trust, free trust, the kind that exists without bars or obligations. I am 72 today, my body creaking with age, but my spirit somehow renewed. I may not see Grace's grandcubs grown, but I know they'll carry something forward, a memory in their cells that humans can be trusted, that kindness transcends species, that love exists in the distance between souls who choose to see each other. The sun is rising higher now, and Grace has led her daughters back into the reserve's depths. Tomorrow at dawn, we'll meet again at our respective ridges, not close enough to touch, but close enough to remember. And in that remembering, Margaret lives, hope lives, and the future stretches before us, wild and free, but forever connected. Ethan closed his journal and prepared for the reserve's Christmas gathering. The staff would celebrate, stories would be shared, and someone would inevitably ask about Grace. He would tell them she was exactly where she should be, living wild, raising wild cubs, but maintaining a thread of connection that proved the boundary between human and nature was never a wall, but always a conversation. As he walked back toward the main compound, a distant chirp echoed across the landscape, Grace's unique call, the one she used only for him. He didn't respond aloud, but his hand rose in acknowledgement. Somewhere out there, a wild cheetah was teaching her cubs that not all humans were the same, that some could be trusted, that love could exist without possession. The story that began with an old man breaking rules to save a dying cheetah ended with that same cheetah saving him, not through proximity, but through distance, not through dependence, but through choice, not through captivity, but through the freedom to leave and the decision to stay connected. 200 meters. It might as well have been 200 miles or 2 inches. Distance was irrelevant when souls recognized each other across species, across space, across the impossible divide between wild and tamed. Grace had chosen her path, neither fully wild nor remotely tame, but something new, something necessary, something that gave hope for a world where humans and wildlife might share the same spaces without losing their essential natures. In the end, the unbelievable thing wasn't that Ethan had saved Grace. It was that Grace had saved him right back, teaching him that love means letting go while staying connected, that freedom and bond aren't opposites but dance partners, that sometimes the greatest gift we can give is the space to be exactly who we are meant to be. I need to tell you something I've learned, something that took 71 years and a dying cheetah to understand. We spend our lives building walls between species, between wild and tame, between ourselves and our grief. We call it being rational, professional, scientific, but sometimes those walls become prisons. Grace taught me that family isn't about blood or even species. It's about showing up at the edge of someone's world, day after day, close enough to care, but far enough to honor who they truly are. Those cubs weren't mine, but for a moment, we were something together, not owner and property, but witnesses to each other's loss and survival. Gratitude doesn't always look like we expect. Sometimes it's a cheetah leaving a rabbit on a rock. Sometimes it's choosing to stay visible when instinct says hide. Sometimes it's the gift of letting someone save you because they desperately need to save something. Margaret knew this. She left me breadcrumbs to Grace because she understood that healing happens in the spaces between heartbeats, where a man who lost everything discovers he can still give everything to something wild and beautiful and free. That's what family really is, the ones who trust us with their wildness.